The notice was still flapping in the breeze when Ruth brought me my coffee, same chipped mug, same porch they called aesthetic pollution. Name's Earl, 68, retired Marine, and that morning smelled like cold bacon grease and cheap printer ink. They came for my porch. I brought out the photo album. Ever had a neighbor tell you tradition's a problem? Earl sipped his bitter black coffee at Daisy's griddle when Ruth handed him the bright yellow notice taped to their front door. The heat from the ceramic mug seeped into his calloused hands, but it couldn't warm the tightening in his chest. He stared at the paper, the bold all-caps font practically shouting at him through the grease-stained table. Notice of violation, it began, followed by lines about unsanctioned visual disturbances, neighborhood standards, and the one phrase that made his eyebrow twitch, excessively patriotic lawn decor. Ruth slid into the booth across from him, her breath fogging the window beside her as she adjusted her scarf. She gave him a look that tried to be soothing. "They've been cracking down again, Earl." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the window, where a gust of wind sent red and orange leaves cartwheeling across the parking lot. Inside the diner, the usual murmur of silverware and conversation formed a backdrop to the faint gospel tune drifting from the radio above the pie fridge. He saw Daisy bustling near the counter, hollering for another round of grits, hot this time, to a pair of white-haired regulars in camo ball caps. Ruth reached for the laminated menu, though she didn't need it. Every Sunday morning was the same, country morning, no substitutions, biscuits with sausage gravy, 2 scrambled eggs. Earl didn't eat much these days, but he liked the ritual. It gave shape to the quiet stretches of retirement, something solid in a world that seemed more arbitrary with every HOA bulletin board update. "Darlin', your usual." The waitress barely paused as she passed, already scribbling. "Yep," Earl muttered. He kept the notice on the table, turning it once, then again, as if the words might reorganize into something sensible. Ruth poured cream into her coffee, watching him with that steady patience she'd honed over 40 years. "You gonna let it go?" she asked softly. He exhaled through his nose. "What the hell does excessively patriotic even mean?" "It means the flagpole bothers Karen again." "It's a 2-foot Marine Corps flag next to the porch hydrangeas, Ruth. Not a missile silo." A chuckle escaped her lips despite herself. "Maybe they think it clashes with the begonias." Earl shook his head. The worst part was that Karen hadn't even come herself, just another letter taped in the early morning, probably by one of those HOA volunteer enforcers who didn't make eye contact. Cowards with clipboards, he thought. Their plates arrived steaming and fragrant. Earl cut into his biscuit and swirled it through the gravy absently. He chewed without tasting. At the next booth, someone was talking about knee surgery gone sideways. Across the room, 2 ladies argued about which church had the better bake sale last week. Outside, the wind carried a dry rustling sound through the trees. October had settled in for good. Daisy swung by and eyed the yellow paper. "Another love letter from the neighborhood Stassi," she quipped. Earl offered a dry smile. "Apparently my front yard is a threat to community cohesion." "Good," Daisy snapped. "This town needs shaking up. Bunch of cowards, all of 'em. You should have seen what Jim had on his porch back in '91, whole tank made out of scrap metal." Ruth chuckled again. "Yes, and the town still talks about it." They walked home slowly, arms tucked against the wind, shoes scuffing against sidewalks freckled with acorns. The leaves in their yard had begun to pile near the gutter, and the Marine flag fluttered gently in the breeze beside the bird feeder. Earl stood looking at it for a moment, jaw clenched. "Earl," Ruth said gently. "Let's just take it down. For now." He looked at her, then at the paper crumpled in his fist. The battle wasn't worth it. Not today, not yet. He reached up, unhooked the flag, and folded it into thirds, fingers trembling slightly. It wasn't about the flag, it never was. It was about someone else deciding how to define dignity. From a few houses down, he saw their neighbor Tom watching through the blinds. A moment later, another curtain fluttered. People were noticing. Maybe that was the worst part. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon. Ruth slipped off her coat and set the kettle on the stove. Earl walked into the den, still holding the folded flag, and paused by the fireplace. He tossed the violation notice in, watched the edges blacken and curl. Then Ruth stepped in, plucked the paper out with an old pair of tongs, and gently smoothed it on the hearth like a document in a crime scene. "You always did move too fast," she said lightly. He grunted. Later, as they sat in their chairs, the silence between them filled with small sounds, the creak of wood, the soft tap of the kettle lid beginning to tremble. Ruth reached over, touched his arm. "We're not alone, you know. They left a notice on Luann's place too." "Birdhouse too loud?" Earl muttered. "Unapproved color on her shutters." He shook his head again. Ruth sighed. "No one wants to speak up. Maybe it's time someone reminded them who this neighborhood really belongs to," Earl mutters. Claire hadn't planned to interview anyone that morning, until Earl raised his voice about HOA tyranny loud enough to shake the sugar shakers. The diner had the same comforting clatter Claire remembered from childhood, ceramic mugs knocking against laminate, the soft hiss of bacon on the griddle, and the unmistakable voice of Daisy hollering over it all. But this morning, something else cut through the haze of breakfast smells and gospel music, sharp, gravelly complaint rising from the corner booth near the window. "I served my country, and now I can't hang a damn flag without a signed affidavit from Karen and her clipboard committee." Claire turned, recognizing the voice before she saw the man. It was the same man she'd spotted on her morning walks, always out in his yard before the sun cleared the treetops, raking leaves with military precision. Today, his face was flushed, finger jabbing toward a small crowd of regulars nodding sympathetically. Next to him sat a woman with kind eyes and neatly styled hair, her hand resting lightly on his arm, trying to calm him without quieting him. That had to be Ruth. Claire remembered her from years ago, singing at the church on Sunday nights. The sugar shakers on their table vibrated with the force of Earl's declaration. A few patrons glanced their way. Most just muttered agreement, grumbled into their grits. Claire reached into her satchel and pulled out her notepad, more out of reflex than intent. The leather was worn to softness at the edges, corners curled from years of reporting. She hadn't planned to write anything today. She hadn't planned much of anything since moving back to Elk Hollow to help care for her father. But stories had a way of finding her, and this one came with gravy and a side of civil disobedience. When the clatter died down, Claire approached the booth. "Excuse me," she said with a tentative smile. "I'm Claire Thomason. I grew up here, moved back recently. I'm, sort of a journalist." Earl's eyes narrowed. "Sort of. I write freelance now," she clarified. "Human interest. Local stories." He looked unconvinced. Ruth, however, offered a smile and nudged the seat across from her. "Sit down, honey. You want some coffee?" "Tea, if they've got it," Claire said, sliding into the booth. "They don't," Earl muttered. "They do if you ask Daisy nicely," Ruth countered. Claire smiled, setting her notepad on the table. She didn't open it just yet. "What was all that about a flag?" she asked gently. Earl hesitated, then sighed. "Just another violation. Third one this year." Ruth explained as Daisy plunked a chipped mug of hot water and a packet of lemon tea in front of Claire. "They're getting stricter. No decorations without approval. No gatherings without permits. No flags over a certain size unless it's the 4th of July. They call it neighborhood cohesion," Earl added. "I call it something else." They chatted for a while, about the rules, about Karen Delaney and her ever-growing list of bylaws, about how the community seemed to have traded neighborliness for regulations. Claire listened, occasionally jotting notes. Her tea grew cold. Later that afternoon, she visited the Tennyson home. The air outside still held a chill, but the living room was warm and cluttered in a way that felt lived in. Pumpkins of various sizes sat on the windowsills, a quilt with orange and burgundy squares draped over the couch, and a faint scent of cinnamon and old books lingered in the air. Claire's eyes drifted to the shelf above the fireplace. Miniature flags were folded in neat triangles, some framed. Earl gestured to a stack of old newsletters on the coffee table. Back when this neighborhood still meant something, he said. Before it turned into a spreadsheet with fences. Claire picked one up, flipping through notes from block parties, chili cook-offs, announcements of births and deaths. There was heart here, buried under bylaws. Ruth appeared with a tray of cookies and a mug of chamomile tea. This is what they want gone, Earl said, gesturing to the fall garland strung around the doorway. Because it distracts from uniform street aesthetics. What the hell does that even mean? Claire made a soft sound of acknowledgement, flipping to the back of a newsletter where a small notice had been taped, new amendments to decoration policies, asterisks, underlines. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small recorder. Would you mind if I asked a few questions formally? She asked. Earl looked at her, then at Ruth, who nodded. If you're gonna write something, write it straight, he said, handing her the stack. As the sun dipped low, Claire sat cross-legged on the rug, surrounded by papers. A faint hum from the dishwasher filled the background. Her fingers brushed against something tucked between the couch cushions, a manila envelope, old and slightly dusty. Inside were clippings, some handwritten notes, and an official-looking form stamped HOA internal memo. She unfolded it carefully. Claire opens a forgotten manila envelope, inside, HOA's clause citing, quiet neighborhood compliance. As Earl raked leaves into neat piles, he noticed Ruth standing still by the mailbox, hands trembling around a new envelope. The cold wind pressed against Earl's back as he moved the rake in slow, deliberate strokes. Golden and rust-colored leaves slid across the lawn like scattered memories, whispering beneath the bristles. He had just finished clearing the walkway when he saw Ruth by the mailbox. She wasn't moving, just standing, stiff, a pale blue envelope crumpling slowly between her fingers. Earl leaned the rake against the porch and jogged over. What is it? Ruth didn't speak right away. She handed him the envelope, her eyes unreadable. Inside, printed on stiff cardstock, was another notice. This one was bolder. Stricter. Violation, unauthorized gathering, subject to fines up to $200 per instance. Further incidents may result in board review. Earl's jaw tightened. Gathering? What gathering? Choir ladies dropped off muffins Tuesday. We sat on the porch, Ruth murmured. Maybe we laughed too loud. He crushed the notice in his palm. The paper crackled, brittle from cold and bureaucracy. Without a word, he walked back to the porch and threw it into the metal pail by the steps. Later that afternoon, over cups of steaming coffee and the scent of baking pecan pie, Claire sat at their kitchen table with Ruth. Her notebook lay open, pen tucked into the spine. Ruth's hands moved rhythmically as she folded the pie crust edges, her expression distant. They're trying to scare us into silence, Claire said softly. The more I dig, the more stories I hear. Ruth offered a tired smile. We're just trying to live. Earl doesn't like to fuss, but this is starting to feel personal. Across town, at Daisy's Griddle, Earl sank into his usual booth. Joe, seated nearby, raised his coffee cup in silent solidarity. Got another one, Earl muttered. Let me guess, improper porch sitting. Joe quipped. They'll be fining us for talking next. Betty, behind the counter, cackled. If they do, they better budget for my mouth. Daisy emerged from the kitchen, apron smudged with flour. They're pushing it. You ask me, Karen's got too much time and not enough friends. Earl managed a chuckle. For the first time in weeks, the weight on his chest lightened. It wasn't just him. That afternoon, Claire made her way to the town's tiny print shop. The bell above the door chimed as she entered. Betty looked up from behind the counter, glasses perched low on her nose. Don't tell me you're here to print wedding invites, she said dryly. Close, Claire replied. Community barbecue flyers. Betty arched an eyebrow. You declaring war or just marinating it first? Claire grinned and handed over a USB. Just an invitation. Everyone's welcome. Food, stories, maybe even some truth. As the printer hummed, Claire leaned against the counter. Think folks will come? If you've got Earl's name on it, you'll fill the lot, Betty said. And if there's pie, even Karen might show. Back at the Tennysons, the kitchen had filled with the buttery aroma of baking pecans. Mason arrived just as Ruth was pulling the pie from the oven. Smells like rebellion, he joked, snapping a picture with his phone. Want me to post about the barbecue? I can make it go semi-viral. Nothing crazy, just local pages. Earl, arms crossed, considered for a moment. Keep it respectful. Mason nodded. Classy subversion. Got it. The next morning, Earl stood before the HOA's message board. It was centered on the cul-de-sac near the park, its cork surface covered in typed notices, rules, and reminders. At the top, in a gilded frame, Karen Delaney's portrait watched with forced benevolence. Earl took a deep breath. The flyer in his hand was simple: community barbecue, all welcome. Sunday at 2 p.m. Bring a dish or bring a story. He pinned it directly beneath Karen's frame, straightened the corners, and stepped back. As he walked away, tires crunched over gravel behind him. He glanced over his shoulder. A white SUV rolled to a stop at the curb. Inside, Karen sat rigidly in the driver's seat, mouth pulled into a tight line. Her eyes flicked from the flyer to Earl, then back again. Karen spots the flyer from her car, lips pursed, dialing her phone. The scent of hickory-smoked ribs drifted through Elk Hollow like a rebellious hymn on a Sunday morning breeze. Earl adjusted the tongs in his hand, flipping a row of ribs that had begun to crisp at the edges. The backyard buzzed with conversation and clinking dishes, fairy lights flickering like fireflies strung between the trees. Folding tables lined the grass, each one crowned with foil-covered casseroles, steaming cornbread, and glass bowls of Betty's tart coleslaw. Ruth, wrapped in a thick shawl, handed out mugs of warm homemade eggnog, the kind that sat gently on the stomach and lit up the chest. Daisy laughed loudest, patting Joe on the shoulder after a joke lost in the shuffle of chatter. Mason crouched beside the smoker with a tripod, the lens of his phone catching the wisps of smoke curling upward. 5,000 views and climbing, he said proudly. Grandpa, you might just be barbecue famous. Earl grunted, lips curling into something close to a smile. As long as the ribs are famous for taste, not tyranny. Claire moved quietly between groups, her leather-bound notepad tucked under one arm. She asked gently, never intruding, jotting down comments about the recent HOA notices. A woman in a fleece vest whispered about a citation she received for excessively ornamental bird feeders. Another man confessed he kept his Halloween pumpkins 2 days too long and got fined $15. These weren't grievances, these were glimpses of something heavier beneath the politeness of porch lights. Deputy Greg showed up mid-afternoon, his cruiser crawling along the curb before he stepped out and gave a long look at the scene. Earl set down his tongs, wiping his hands on the apron that boldly read, "Kiss the cook, unless you're HOA." Greg approached slowly, adjusting his belt out of habit. Got a call. Anonymous complaint about an unauthorized event. Earl crossed his arms. You here to break up ribs and potato salad? Greg surveyed the tables, the cheerful crowd, the harmonica playing a slow rendition of Take Me Home, Country Roads. He exhaled and raised one brow. I'm here to make sure no one double dips the bean dip. Save me a plate. That earned a cheer. Ruth fixed him a generous portion before he could change his mind. The afternoon melted into golden light, faces warmed more by fellowship than food. Claire tucked into her notes at a corner table, sipping eggnog, watching Mason coach Joe on how to angle a phone for better lighting. Earl made the rounds with a slow stride and a heavy gaze, one of satisfaction, but also wariness. He had seen enough in life to know that peace this easy never lasted. The first sign of it came just after sunset, when the sky was painted a deep bruised blue. Claire's phone buzzed, a notification from an unknown number. The message was brief, with no greeting and no name. Stop stirring things up, or we'll find a reason to shut you down. She stared at the words, the chill in the air suddenly sharper. Across the yard, she met Earl's eyes. He didn't ask, and she didn't tell, not yet. From a parked SUV across the street, Karen Delaney watched. Her window rolled halfway down, a pen poised over a small notebook. As each guest left, she noted their license plate numbers with a cold deliberation, lips pursed tight enough to turn white. Mason's live stream had barely ended when Earl's phone lit up with a voicemail from an HOA attorney. The screen blinked twice before settling into stillness, but the tremor in Ruth's fingers as she dried the breakfast plates spoke volumes. Earl pressed play on speaker, the living room quiet except for the voice of Mr. Sutton, measured, low, and sharp enough to cut butter in winter. This message is for Mr. Earl Tennyson. You are in violation of Elk Hollow Covenant Clause 18b, activities likely to disturb the peace or cohesion of the neighborhood. Continued defiance may lead to civil proceedings. We'll let the court sort this out. Ruth placed the plate down slowly, porcelain tapping the counter. Peace or cohesion, my foot, she muttered. Across the hall, Mason sat hunched over his laptop. He had edited the barbecue footage into a clean, 5-minute highlight reel, slow pans of neighbors smiling, Ruth pouring eggnog, Deputy Greg nodding along to a harmonica tune, all underscored by Mason's quiet narration. This is what community looks like when it's left alone. He posted it on the Veterans of Missouri forum with a simple caption, "This happened in Elk Hollow. Still proud to serve." By noon, the clip had over 20,000 views and nearly as many comments. Claire sat by the window in Been There, a cozy cafe that smelled of cinnamon and burnt espresso, her old Dell wheezing as it opened the word processor. She sipped slowly from a chipped mug, fingers dancing over the keys. Her article unfolded like a ribbon, facts, quotes, moments stitched with clarity. She called it Elk Hollow vs. HOA, a quiet rebellion. By the time she hit send, the owner had turned the radio to a local news station. The segment hadn't finished before her inbox began to ping. At home, Ruth busied herself with care packages, zippered pouches of pain balm, hand-knit socks, plastic-wrapped peanut brittle. She stacked them by the door, each one labeled with a name in her looping handwriting. For Margaret, one read. For Dennis. For Sweet Ethel, who still crochets hats for the newborns. None of them had been at the barbecue. Some hadn't left their houses in weeks. The article posted that afternoon. It opened with a picture Mason had taken, Earl in front of the smoker, laughing, apron smeared with barbecue sauce and pride. Within an hour, emails poured in, some angry, most supportive. Veterans offered solidarity, retired lawyers offered guidance, even a Missouri state judge sent a quiet, off-the-record, keep going. Claire read each message, her breath shallow with disbelief. Hank, a Navy vet from Joplin, wrote, "Never thought I'd see someone stand up for a flagpole in a cul-de-sac and get threatened with court. Count me in." Someone else offered to start a legal fund. Another said simply, "We remember who you are, Earl. And we've got your 6." Earl didn't say much that evening. He sat on the porch, the sky dimming behind him, the printed article folded open in his hands. He read every line twice, underlined Claire's name softly with his thumb. Ruth sat beside him, silent. The breeze tugged at the corner of the paper, like it, too, was anxious. He finally spoke, voice low. "I never thought raising a flag and feeding neighbors would lead to lawyers." "You raised more than a flag," Ruth answered gently. "You reminded people what matters." From across the street, a car idled, then slowly drove off. Earl didn't look up. Later, as the porch light flickered on, Mason emerged with his phone. "You might want to see this," he said, handing it over. On screen was a news alert, "Governor of Missouri announces humanitarian outreach visit to Elk Hollow this weekend." The screen pulsed with the notification, bold and unwavering. Earl had just stuck his Marine Corps flag back in the flower bed when a black SUV with state plates rolled onto his street. The soil was damp beneath his boots, frost still crusted along the grass edges. He stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans, as the SUV door opened and a woman in a gray cashmere coat stepped out. She moved with quiet confidence, her silver-streaked hair pulled neatly back, a single lapel pin catching the faint morning light, a small, proud badge that read Veteran's Daughter. Ruth appeared at the doorway holding a tray of warm scones, her apron still dusted with flour. Mr. Tennyson, the woman said, extending her hand. Governor Evelyn Reeves. Earl's grip was firm. Ma'am. Welcome to Elk Hollow. A small crowd had gathered in front yards, watching from behind fences, some with coffee mugs in hand. Flags lined the sidewalks, American, Marine Corps, and Missouri banners fluttered with stubborn grace in the cold air. The town had swept the streets, trimmed hedges, even set out folding chairs in case the governor stayed longer than polite. Inside the Tennyson home, the air was sweet with cinnamon and butter. Governor Reeves took a seat in the kitchen, declining coffee but accepting a scone with quiet thanks. Ruth placed a linen napkin beside her. Claire hovered with her notepad, Mason already setting up a tripod in the corner. They didn't talk politics. Instead, the governor asked Earl how long he'd lived here, what the winters were like, whether he still grilled even when it snowed. He answered simply, Ruth adding a gentle word now and then. When the plates were cleared, Claire offered to walk her around the block. Together they passed porch swings, shuttered windows, and faded wreaths, each home with a story. At every third house, Claire pointed to something, a letter posted in plastic, a flag removed from its mount, a gathering cancelled before it began. Reeves listened, face unreadable, only nodding once when Claire mentioned a veteran denied permission to build a wheelchair ramp. The HOA office sat 2 blocks down, modest and officious. A brass plaque beside the door read, Elk Hollow Neighborhood Council. Karen was waiting outside, lips tight, scarf wrapped too tightly. When Reeves approached, Karen offered a rehearsed smile. Governor, I wish we'd had more notice, she began. You've had plenty of notice, Reeves replied, voice even. Your letters speak for themselves. Karen gestured toward the office. Would you like to see our charter? I've seen enough. Reeves took one step closer, eyes level. You may run this board, but you don't run this state. The silence that followed was brittle as ice. Inside the building, a few HOA members peeked from behind doorframes. Claire stood back, scribbling in her notebook, her phone buzzing once in her coat pocket. Mason caught it on video, Reeves facing down Karen, the town behind her. Later, he'd edit it with soft piano music and upload it as, The Day Elk Hollow Stood Still. By early afternoon, Reeves stepped back into the Tennysons' living room and made her announcement, brief, direct. The state would begin an official audit of HOA regulations, starting with Elk Hollow. Pending review, the HOA was advised to halt enforcement actions. Several neighbors clapped quietly from the porch. As people began to disperse, Ruth pressed another scone into the governor's hand. For the road, she said. Reeves smiled for the first time that morning. Before leaving, the governor turned to Claire. I've heard about your reporting. Claire straightened. Publish whatever you find, Reeves said. The public deserves to know. Claire's fingers curled tightly around her notepad. I just received something, actually, 10 minutes ago. Internal HOA emails. Someone sent them anonymously. Reeves didn't blink. Then you know what to do. Claire tapped her tablet and projected the HOA's internal minutes onto the wall of the Elk Hollow Community Center. The room had once hosted potlucks and quilting bees. Now, every wooden chair was filled, some with older men in flannel jackets, some with women holding Tupperware full of baked goods. Daisy's Glaze had donated donuts, still warm, and coffee brewed in 2 silver urns steamed on the side table. A blackboard behind Claire bore the faded chalk outline of last week's bingo game. Ruth sat beside Earl in the second row, her hands folded on her lap. Mason hovered near the printer by the window, feeding fresh copies into a plastic bin. 50 sets of documents, stapled and ready. Joe, in his old bomber jacket, leaned against the back wall, arms crossed but eyes sharp. Claire stood at the front, wearing her soft purple cardigan, the sleeves a little too long. What you're about to see, she said calmly, are meeting records from the HOA's internal files. These were never intended for public release. But they concern every household here. The first document lit up the beige wall, a time-stamped email from Karen Delaney to 3 board members, skipping the usual quorum and stating, "We'll proceed with the fines, no need to wait on formal vote." Delay risks further patriotic displays. Gasps, then murmurs. Claire tapped again. A spreadsheet appeared, columns of names, addresses, fine amounts, and handwritten notes like "flag too large," "hosted unauthorized gathering," and "watch for further infractions." Ruth leaned forward to read. Joe raised his hand. "You mean to tell me," he said, voice loud, "they fined over 20 families without a vote?" 31, Claire said. "Totaling $12,800 in unauthorized penalties." Mason stepped forward and began handing out printed copies. Paper rustled as neighbors passed pages down the rows. Karen stood at the back, lips drawn tight. "These documents are misrepresented," she said quickly. "Taken out of context. They were drafts. Drafts with signatures." Betty called from the left aisle, holding her bifocals to the page. "Seems pretty official to me." Karen straightened. "These aren't final. And they're not meant for open discussion." Legal counsel. Mr. Sutton, the HOA attorney, appeared in the doorway, briefcase in hand, scarf askew. "We advise all residents not to jump to conclusions," he said. "We're conducting our own review." Joe stood up slowly, face lined, steady. "I served in Nam so you could run a petty empire here." His words fell heavy. "So you could tell veterans how many stars and stripes they can fly." Applause broke out, soft at first, then rolling through the room like wind through dry leaves. Someone shouted, "Resign." Then others, "Resign. Enough. Give it back." Karen's expression faltered. She clutched her purse tightly, turned toward Sutton, but he said nothing. Just gave a small, helpless shrug. She moved toward the side door, footsteps clipped against the linoleum. No one stopped her. Even the children, 2 teens leaning near the snack table, stayed silent. As the door clicked shut behind her, Ruth quietly stood. She walked to a smaller door near the coat rack, opened it, and reached up. The HOA flag, once proudly pinned above the community bulletin board, now hung limp. She tugged it down in one slow motion, folded it against her chest. In its place, she hung the blue and white banner of Missouri. Its single star caught the room's attention. There was no applause. Just quiet. A silence that said more than cheers ever could. Earl flipped the last slab of ribs as soft country music played from a weathered radio perched on the porch. The voice of Tammy Wynette curled around the falling snowflakes like a lullaby for the season. Ruth adjusted the small evergreen tree near the steps, threading a strand of vintage lights through its branches. Each bulb lit gently in the growing dusk, reds, greens, and a few blinking ambers that blinked just a bit too slow. Joe arrived first, bundled in his thick coat, carrying a folded flag tucked carefully under one arm. "Had it in my attic since '72, he said simply, pressing the triangle of blue stars into Earl's hands. "Thought it might belong with someone who'd use it right." Earl nodded, words caught behind a stiff smile. Betty brought a tray of pecan cookies and 2 thermoses of cider. "Don't ask about the sugar count," she warned. "Let's pretend we're young tonight." Deputy Gregg came next, radio off, his uniform replaced by a thick sweater and jeans. He took a rib without asking, chewed with reverence. "Official word came this morning," he said between bites. "HOA Elk Hollow is dissolved. Permanently." Ruth looked to Earl, then to the newly carved wooden sign that Mason had helped her mount on the porch rail. Letters burned gently into the grain red. Elk Hollow, a town of neighbors, not rulers. Just below, Ruth bent down and gently placed a single white daisy, her quiet tribute. Claire stepped out from inside, her old laptop bag slung over one shoulder. "The bus to Springfield's in an hour," she said. "But I left a little something on your kitchen table." Inside, beside Ruth's quilted table runner, lay a printed draft with Claire's familiar headline. "Elk Hollow vs. HOA, when small towns say no. Going national," she added. "USA Today took it. Said they'll run it before Christmas." Mason tapped his phone. "And the new site's up. Citizens of Elk Hollow. Forums, neighborhood updates, even a pie recipe section. Might be a real community again. The group chuckled, and for a while, no one said much. They watched snow coat the lawn in clean, forgiving layers. The kind of snowfall that makes even cracked sidewalks look new. As the evening stretched on, people drifted home. Joe left a firm handshake. Betty hugged Ruth and kissed Earl's cheek. Mason lingered just long enough to promise more firewood by morning. Earl stayed out on the porch after the last goodbye. The ribs were gone, the cider cool. He sat in the creaky chair beside the flag Joe had given him, eyes half closed, listening. "Stand by your man" came on the radio. He didn't change the station. When he finally stood to go inside, the wind caught the mailbox lid just enough to knock it open. A thick envelope tumbled out, its edge landing in a patch of snow. He bent down, squinting at the seal. Office of the Governor, confidential. He stood still for a long moment, then slipped it under his arm and walked back into the house. The porch light flicked on behind him, casting a soft glow over the new sign that swayed gently in the night breeze. The snow had barely settled on Elk Hollow's rooftops when quiet laughter drifted once more from Earl's porch. No bylaws, no citations, just neighbors sharing pie and stories. What began as a flag in a flowerbed became a flame that thawed silence, revealing just how far a community could go when dignity was threatened. When rules are used for good, communities thrive. When they're misused, they crumble. Perhaps it's never too late to join hands with neighbors, to speak up for what's right, no matter how quiet your street once seemed. And like a front porch light left on through the night, one act of courage can guide a whole town home.